Okay, so today we're getting into something pretty fundamental. How do we even begin to understand and compare the well-being of different people, especially when we're trying to figure out what makes a situation good for everyone?
Yeah, it's a huge question.
It is a huge question.
Right. And luckily, we have some tools. We've got a bunch of ideas from philosophy and economics that grapple with exactly this, all centered around the idea of, can we even compare well being across people? And that's what we're calling comparable well being. So today, our goal is to really dig into these foundational ideas and figure out why these comparisons even matter in the first place.
Yeah, I think what's going to be really interesting to explore is how much information do we even need to make these comparisons? And what kind of information is valid? Is it, just asking someone, hey, how happy are you from a scale of 1 to 10? Or is it more complicated than that?
It is definitely more complicated than that.
Yeah, so let's get into it.
Yeah, definitely. So, you might recall from our previous deep dives that we often use this idea of utility to represent like how well off someone is. It's like a numerical representation of their well-being. But the big question that pops up that we're going to tackle today is when we have these individual utility numbers, how do we even begin to combine them to say something about how well off society is as a whole? Like, is it just a matter of adding them all up? Or is it, more nuanced than that?
It feels like there should be some kind of weighting system. Like if someone's having a really, really bad day, should that count more towards like the societal total well-being? You know what I mean? Like should we be trying to prioritize the people who are worse off, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a great intuition. And it really cuts to the heart of why simply adding utility numbers up might not be the whole story. So that's actually where we're going to start today, figuring out why that's problematic and what assumptions we need to make to even make those calculations meaningful.
Okay, let's unpack this whole problematic thing a little bit. I guess before we even get to comparing well-being across different people, like how do we even make sense of well-being for a single person?
Right.
Like what types of statements can we even make about it?
That's a great question. So, to figure out what kind of comparisons we can even make about well being, we need to understand, like you said, the types of statements we can make about it and what kind of mathematical transformations we can apply to these utility numbers without changing the truth of those statements. So, like, what are the rules of the game when we're talking about well being?
Okay, it kind of sounds like we're looking at different levels of precision in our well-being measurements almost.
Exactly.
So like where do we start?
So, the most basic level is what we call ordinal statements.
Hmm.
And this is where we can only really say if one thing is simply better than another for someone. Like, for example, let's say Anne prefers going to Canada for a holiday over going to Thailand. That's an ordinal statement. And this statement, this preference, remains true even if we multiply all of Anne's utility numbers, her utility scores, by any positive number, right?
Yeah.
Because all we're saying is Canada's better than Thailand. The order is the same, whether Canada has, a utility of 7 or 70.
Right, yeah. Yeah, it's like saying coffee is your first choice no matter if you rate it a 7 out of 10 or it's 70 out of 100.
Exactly, exactly. It's just about the order.
Okay.
Now, we can get a little bit more precise and we can move to what we call cardinal statements. And this is where we can start to say by how much one thing is better than another.
Okay.
So let's go back to Anne. And let's say for her, the difference in well being between going to Canada and Thailand is like 3 times greater than the difference between going to Thailand and just staying at home. So now we're talking about the intensity of preferences.
Yeah, okay. The
Right.
magnitude of that preference.
Exactly. Yeah. So this kind of statement holds true even if we multiply her utility scores by a positive number, like we did before with ordinal, but we can also add a constant to it, and the statement stays true.
Okay, so it's still about like the relative differences. So
Exactly.
it's like imagine a thermometer.
Uh-huh.
The difference between 20 degrees and 30 degrees is the same magnitude as the difference between 70 degrees and 80 degrees.
Yeah. Perfect analogy.
Okay.
So now we can get to the most precise, the strongest type of statement, which is a ratio scale statement. And this is the most informationally rich statement.
Okay.
And this allows us to say something about the ratios of well-being levels. So for example, imagine Bob gets 5 times the amount of well-being from going to Canada compared to just staying home.
Wow, he really likes Canada.
Yeah. He really likes Canada, right? So this statement about the ratio, it's only preserved if we multiply all of his utility scores by some positive constant. We can't add anything because we're talking about a ratio. Like think of it like comparing heights. Someone who is 6 feet tall is twice as tall as someone who is 3 feet tall. And that ratio, it holds true whether you're measuring in feet or inches.
Gotcha.
So you see how this forms kind of a hierarchy.
Yeah.
If we have ratio scale information about someone's well-being, we automatically have the cardinal information and the ordinal information.
Right.
Right, because it's the most informationally rich.
But if we just know the order, like their preference ranking, that doesn't tell us anything about how much they prefer one thing over another.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So ordinal gives us the least amount of information, ratio scale gives us the most. And the big question is, why do these distinctions even matter for our big goal of figuring out what's good for everyone? Like, how does knowing if we have ordinal, cardinal, or ratio scale information actually help us decide what's a better outcome for society?
Well, I think this all ties back to our moral frameworks, right?
Exactly.
Like the information we need about well-being really depends on what ethical theory we're using to make judgments, like if we're utilitarians, if we're egalitarians.
Yeah, that's a great point. So the kind of information we need about well-being really depends on our moral theory.
Right.
And to see that, let's start with maybe the most famous moral theory, the utilitarian principle. So the utilitarian social welfare function, or SWF for short, it evaluates outcomes based on the total sum of well-being across all individuals.
Okay, so like back to Ann and Bob.
Yeah.
We're just trying to figure out, is Canada a better vacation spot for them, or is Thailand, if we're utilitarians, we're just looking at the sum total of their happiness in either place.
Exactly. So if we assume, if we're working with these cardinal numbers that represent their well-being and we're assuming they're comparable, we can figure out which option is better for both of them together by just adding up their scores for each destination. And whichever has the higher total, well, that's the better option.
So this is where this principle we've talked about before called P4 comes into play.
Yeah.
Cardinal comparability.
Exactly, yeah. P4 is essential for utilitarianism.
Right. So it's got two parts.
Yeah.
The first one is that individual well-being has a cardinal structure, which we just talked about, those different levels of information.
Yeah.
And then the second part, which is really important for what we're talking about today, is that it says that the gains and losses in well-being that different people experience can be meaningfully compared.
Exactly. That's the crucial assumption.
So that means we can literally say like, oh, Bob's increase in happiness from going to Canada is like twice as much as Anne's decrease in happiness from staying home.
Mm-hmm.
Like we can actually compare those.
Yeah, we can make those comparisons across people, which is a pretty strong assumption.
Yeah.
But utilitarianism needs that.
Okay, so let's step back for a second and just clarify what a social welfare function is doing in the first place. I mean, you threw out the acronym SWF.
Yeah.
But what is it actually doing?
Yeah, so a social welfare function is basically like a rule, like a recipe.
Okay.
That takes information about individual well-being in different scenarios, like Canada versus Thailand.
Right.
And spits out a ranking of those scenarios based on how good they are for society overall.
Okay.
So it's like a way of aggregating individual well-being into some kind of social judgment. And for now, we're assuming what philosophers call consequentialism, which basically means that only the outcomes of actions matter morally.
Okay.
So we're not looking at, people's intentions or anything like that.
Just the outcome.
Just the outcome.
Gotcha.
And then we're also assuming welfarism, which means that the only thing that matters morally within those outcomes is individual well-being.
Okay.
So we're not looking at, rights or liberties or anything else, just well-being.
So our SWS is only taking into account people's well-being and the outcomes that produce different levels of well-being.
Exactly.
And it's ranking those outcomes.
Exactly.
Oh.
So the crucial point here is that the choice of which social welfare function we actually use really depends on what philosophers call informational assumptions, which is a fancy way of saying, what kind of information about well-being do we think we have, and can we even compare it across different people?
Right, yeah.
Like, are we assuming we can compare Bob's happiness to Anne's happiness? Or are we just looking at each person individually? So today, we're focusing on the case where we're assuming comparability.
Right.
But we're going to challenge this in a future deep dive.
Okay, so it's like today we're playing in the sandbox, but we're going to go beyond the sandbox in a future deep dive.
Exactly, yeah. We're going to break out of the sandbox.
Okay, so unit cardinal comparability, this P4 thing.
Yeah.
Let's define this a little bit more precisely.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, let's get a bit more specific. So a statement about Anne and Bob's well-being, let's say, it's unit cardinal comparable if the truth of that statement stays the same, even if we mess around with their individual utility numbers in a specific way.
Yeah.
So We can do these transformations, but there are rules. We can multiply all of their scores by the same positive number,
Okay.
but we can add different constants to each person's scores. So it's like shifting their whole utility scale up or down by a bit. But the important thing is that we're multiplying by the same number. So the relative distances between their utility scores are preserved.
Okay, so let's go back to our vacation example.
Yeah.
We've got these initial cardinal utility scores, and we're assuming they're comparable
Right.
for Anne and Bob. And we're comparing Canada and Thailand.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, let's say we're getting a little crazy. We're multiplying all of their scores by, I don't know, 3, just to make things interesting.
Yeah, why not?
And then we're going to add 2 to all of Anne's scores. And we're going to subtract 1 from all of Bob's scores.
Yeah.
Just, to mix things up.
Just to make sure it works.
Yeah. So the point is that if the sum of their original utility scores, before we messed with them, was higher for Canada than Thailand, then the sum of their transformed scores should also be higher for Canada than Thailand.
Exactly. The comparison based on the total well-being, it should stay consistent.
Okay, so the idea here is that comparisons that are based on just adding up everybody's well-being, they're unit cardinal comparable.
That's right, yeah.
So if a utilitarian says Canada is better than Thailand based on one unit cardinal comparable way of representing well-being, then they should also come to the same conclusion if we use any other unit cardinal comparable representation.
Precisely.
And that's why utilitarianism relies on this specific type of comparability.
Exactly. It needs at least that.
So this kind of highlights the point that for utilitarianism to even make sense as a framework, it's not enough to just have cardinal well-being measurements for each person.
Yeah.
Like, we have to make sure that the entire utility profile we're working with accurately represents well-being and this idea that gains and losses are comparable across different individuals.
Exactly. Yeah, the whole picture needs to be consistent. It's not just about having the numbers for each person, but the relationships between those numbers have to make sense too. And that's where unit cardinal comparability comes in.
So just to be clear, we've been talking about Anne and Bob, but this all applies to bigger groups of people, societies.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Right, like this is a scalable concept.
Absolutely. So, for simplicity, we're sticking with Anne and Bob.
Right.
But all these concepts, they generalize to larger groups, to entire societies.
Gotcha. Okay, so you mentioned this term full cardinal comparability earlier.
Yeah.
What's the difference between that and unit cardinal comparability?
Yeah, so full cardinal comparability is a kind of a stricter requirement.
Okay.
So here, the positive linear transformation that we apply has to be exactly the same for everybody. So not only do we multiply everyone's scores by the same positive number, we also have to add the same constant to everybody's scores.
Okay, so unit cardinal comparability allows us to shift people's utility scales up or down by different amounts.
Yeah.
But full cardinal comparability, everyone has to shift by the same amount.
Exactly. So it's a more demanding requirement. And while it's definitely interesting theoretically, unit cardinal comparability, it turns out, is enough for utilitarianism to do its thing, to sum up well-being and rank outcomes.
Right.
So that's why we focus on unit cardinal comparability.
Okay, so utilitarianism, through this principle P4, cardinal comparability,
Yeah.
it's making a pretty strong assumption. Right?
Yeah.
Like, it's saying that we can measure well-being for different people on basically the same scale.
Yeah, up to a constant.
Yeah, up to a constant, so that we can actually make these comparisons.
Yeah.
And you briefly mentioned these von Neumann-Morgenstern V&M utility functions.
Yeah.
Like, is that an example of how we could get this kind of same scale measurement?
Yeah, so the V&M utility functions, they're derived from how people make choices under uncertainty.
Okay.
And some people think they provide a foundation for this kind of scale. The idea is that by looking at how people make risky decisions,
Okay.
we can sort of anchor their utility functions in a way that lets us compare their preferences more meaningfully.
Okay.
Like how much they really value one thing versus another. But this is a debated area.
Okay.
Not everyone agrees that V&M utility functions are the answer here. But the key point is that utilitarianism, its reliance on P4, is a big assumption.
Yeah.
It's assuming that we can measure and compare well-being across people in a pretty robust way.
Okay, so P4 is a big deal for utilitarianism. Now, what about this other principle? P5.
Yeah, P5.
Transitional equity.
Yeah.
This is also tied to utilitarianism?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So principle P5, it basically says that if we start with some outcome and we tweak it, we increase one person's well-being by a certain amount, let's call it X, and at the same time we decrease another person's well-being by the same amount.
Okay.
So it's like a transfer of well-being.
Right, it's a zero-sum transfer.
Exactly, a zero-sum transfer. P5 says the new outcome after the transfer is just as good as the original outcome
Okay.
from a moral perspective.
So it's like if we're just shuffling well-being around, keeping the total the same,
Yeah,
utilitarianism doesn't care.
exactly. Yeah, as long as the total stays the same, utilitarianism like, meh, whatever.
Okay. So this principle really hinges on P4 being true. Like
Right.
on us being able to talk about equal gains and losses and well-being between different people.
Exactly, yeah. It's all about comparability again.
So what does this P5 principle tell us about how utilitarianism views equality?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So P5 suggests that utilitarianism is mainly concerned with maximizing the total well-being in society.
rather than how that well-being is distributed.
Okay, so it doesn't care if one person has all the well-being and everyone else has none.
Well, not exactly.
Okay.
It would prefer if that well-being was spread out more evenly,
Okay.
but only because that would likely lead to a higher total.
Okay.
It's not concerned with equality for its own sake.
Gotcha.
So imagine we have Anne and Bob again in different scenarios.
Okay.
And the total well-being is the same across all these scenarios.
Okay.
Utilitarianism, guided by P5, it would say all those scenarios are equally good.
Even if one of them is super unequal.
Even if one of them has a very uneven distribution of that well-being. And this is actually a major criticism that people have against utilitarianism, because many people would argue that a just society, it should care about fairness.
Right.
It should care about how well-being is distributed, not just the total amount.
Yeah, it seems intuitive that a society with massive disparities in well-being shouldn't be considered as good as a more equal society, even if the total amount of well-being is the same.
Yeah, a lot of people would say that. And that's why, some people think utilitarianism is missing something.
Right.
It doesn't really have a place for equality as a value in itself.
Okay, so if we do care about equality, if we think that matters, are there alternative ethical frameworks that kind of incorporate that value?
Yeah, absolutely. So this dissatisfaction with utilitarianism and its potential to ignore equality has led to other theories that really put equality front and center.
Okay.
So we have egalitarianism, prioritarianism, and maximin approaches like Rawlsianism.
Okay, so those are our contenders.
Those are our contenders.
Okay.
Yeah. And a key link between these alternative theories is this. If we care about equality in some form, then we need to be able to compare people's well-being in a way that lets us say when two people are actually equal.
Right. Okay, we need a shared scale.
Exactly. Yeah, we need that shared measuring stick.
Okay, so let's start with egalitarianism. You mentioned earlier that it requires full cardinal comparability.
Yeah.
So why is that?
Yeah, so egalitarianism at its core prioritizes the quality of well-being.
Okay.
So it's not just about the total amount, like utilitarianism.
Right.
It's about how evenly that well-being is spread out. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has to have the exact same amount of resources,
Okay.
because egalitarianism recognizes that people might have different needs to achieve the same level of well-being,
Right.
but the focus is on the distribution of well-being itself.
Okay.
So, to assess how equal the distribution of well-being is, we need to be able to make these cardinal comparisons.
Yeah.
We need to say not just who is better off, but by how much. And we need to compare those magnitudes across different people, like using a common scale.
Okay.
And that's why we need full cardinal comparability.
So it's not enough to just say that Bob is happier than Anne.
Yeah.
We need to be able to say Bob is like twice as happy as Anne or 3 times as happy or whatever.
Exactly. We need that precision to measure how unequal their well-being is.
Okay. And how might we go about representing this idea of equality in a social welfare function? Like, how can we actually build that into our judgment of how good an outcome is?
Yeah, so one way to do that is through what we call a simple egalitarian SWF.
Okay.
So for Anne and Bob, we could define social welfare as the sum of their well-being, their utilities, minus some measure of inequality, like the absolute difference between their well-being levels.
Okay, so the bigger the difference between their well-being, the worse the outcome is considered.
Yeah, exactly. Even if the total well-being stays the same, the bigger the difference, the lower the social welfare score because we're subtracting that difference.
Okay, so it's like we're directly penalizing inequality in our judgment of how good an outcome is.
Exactly, yeah. We're building a penalty right into the function. Now, this kind of approach, though, it faces what's called the leveling down objection.
Oh, right. Yeah, that sounds kind of tricky.
Yeah, it's a pretty famous objection to some egalitarian ideas. So let's stick with our simple egalitarian SWF.
Okay.
Imagine Anne has a utility of 10 and Bob has a utility of 15. So the inequality there is 5.
Right.
If they both have 10, the inequality is 0. And the SWF, it actually increases.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right.
We're rewarding
Yeah,
equality.
exactly. We're assuming here that, the penalty for inequality, it outweighs any decrease in total well-being in some cases.
Okay.
So now imagine a scenario where they both have 9.
Okay.
So the total well-being has gone down.
Yeah.
But the inequality is still 0.
Right.
So depending on how exactly we've set up this SWF, it might actually say that this 9-9 outcome is better than the 10-15 outcome because of the lower inequality, even though someone is worse off and no one is better off.
Yeah, so we actually made everyone worse off just to achieve more equality.
Yeah, that's the leveling down objection.
And that seems pretty problematic.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive.
Right.
Like it just doesn't feel right.
It doesn't feel right. And utilitarianism, it actually avoids this problem because any decrease in total well-being is always going to lead to a lower utilitarian score.
Right.
So that's one potential issue with some egalitarian approaches, this idea of leveling down. Now, you also mentioned this term, equality respecting SWFs.
Right.
So let's unpack that a bit.
What are those?
Yeah, so an SWF, it's equality respecting if for a given total amount of well-being, it ranks the perfectly equal distribution as the best outcome.
Okay.
So our simple egalitarian SWF that we talked about, it actually has this property.
Okay.
So if the total well-being for Anne and Bob, let's say it's 20, any way of distributing that 20, the most equal distribution, 10, 10,
Right.
it's always going to be ranked as at least as good as any other distribution.
Okay, so any deviation from perfect equality is going to result in a lower score.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's what it means to be equality respecting. Gotcha. So are there like general mathematical formulas for egalitarian SWFs?
Yeah, a lot of them can be represented in this kind of general form. So you
Okay.
have like f of UA plus f of UB plus this EQ term. So UA and UB, those represent the well-being of Anne and Bob.
Right.
F is just some function that increases as well-being increases.
Okay.
And then EQ is a term that captures the value of equality, like how much we care about equality in the distribution.
So the specific form of these functions, f and eq, they determine how sensitive the SWF is to changes in well-being and changes in equality.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that can also affect whether or not the SWF is vulnerable to this leveling down problem that we talked about.
Exactly, yeah. Different egalitarian SWFs are going to have different properties depending on how we specify those functions.
Okay.
Okay, so we've talked about utilitarianism, we've talked about egalitarianism. Let's move on to another contender, prioritarianism.
Okay.
So how does prioritarianism view equality, and what kind of information does it need?
Yeah. How's it different from those first two?
Yeah, so prioritarianism agrees with utilitarianism that increasing well-being is generally good.
Okay.
But it adds this extra wrinkle. It says that improving the well-being of those who are worse off is morally more important.
Okay. So it's not just about the total amount of well-being.
Right.
It's about who's receiving it.
Exactly. It's about targeting those increases in well-being to the people who need it most.
Okay. That makes sense.
So one way to represent a simple prioritarian SWF is to use the square root function.
Okay.
So you have like the square root of UA plus the square root of UB,
Okay.
and the shape of the square root function is really important here.
Yeah. What's so special about the square root function?
Yeah, so the square root function, it has this property called concavity,
Okay.
which basically means that if you transfer like 1 unit of well-being from someone with higher utility to someone with lower utility, the overall SWF score, it's going to increase more than if you did the transfer in the opposite direction.
Okay, so we get more bang for our buck if we give that extra unit of well-being to the person who's already worse off.
Exactly. And it's the same if we're just adding an extra unit of well-being.
Okay.
Adding it to the person with lower well-being gives you a bigger increase in the SWF than adding it to the person who's already doing well.
Okay, so this concavity thing is capturing the idea that there are diminishing returns to well-being.
Yeah, exactly. That's the intuition behind prioritarianism. It's like the more well-being you have, the less each additional unit really matters.
Right.
So those early units, they make a big difference.
Especially for those who are worse off.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the rationale for prioritizing them.
So what about more generally? Is there like a general formula for prioritarian SWFs?
Yeah, so generally they take this form like f of UA plus f of UB, where f is just any function that's increasing. So more well-being is always better. But it also has to be concave
Okay.
to capture this idea of priority for the worse off.
Okay, so it's increasing in concaves.
Yep.
Gotcha. So how do prioritarian SWFs deal with the leveling down objection, and are they equality respecting?
Yeah, so because the function f is always increasing, prioritarian SWFs avoid the leveling down objection.
Okay.
Because making someone worse off is always going to decrease the SWF score.
All right.
And they're also equality respecting because for any unequal distribution, you can always improve it by transferring some well-being from the better off person to the worse off person.
Right.
And that's because of the concavity of F. But prioritarianism, it requires full ratio scale comparability.
Ratio scale again?
Ratio scale is back.
Yeah. Why does prioritarianism need something so strong?
Yeah, it's a good question. So full ratio scale comparability, where we can only multiply everyone's scores by the same constant, it's necessary because the concavity of the function needs to be interpreted the same way across all individuals.
Okay.
If we could add different constants to each person's scores, the shape of the concave function, and how much priority we give to the worse off,
Right.
it would change in arbitrary ways. And that would mess.